Harvard Divinity School.
Uses and abuses of power in alternative spiritualities. Implications for spiritual care of patients and communities. April 28, 2023.
Thank you for the introduction. This is probably going to be everyone's 17,000th time hearing a paper about Foucault and his Society Must Be Defended. His lectures in 1976 and 1977 at the Collège de France. So I want to acknowledge that I'm not claiming to have a new reading on his work. Instead, my writing will have the typical limitations you might expect from a first-year master's student, namely an overenthusiasm for Foucault's rhetoric. On a more serious note, though, I was moved by Foucault's idea of biopower because it informed my own experience as a survivor of spiritual communities where leaders who abused their powers were also alternative health practitioners. Unfortunately, these wounds in my life reverberate in my family and my community. The harm that some communities have caused me has left irreconcilable wounds in my life and provoked me to search for meaning within those experiences. I won't be sharing more details about my autoethnographic examination of the abuse of biopower for the sake of my own safety. I will, however, by means of self-positioning, state that as a queer person, I've been subject to harassment, scapegoating, and shaming as a way to control my body in the context of spiritual community. As a person with neurological developmental disability, namely autism, I am especially vulnerable and have been subjected to severe financial and emotional abuse. As a refugee, my experience of the state is strange and detached from grounded and embodied intergenerational community building. As a person of faith, all of these factors together have made me especially susceptible to manipulation through shared spiritual identity. It's for that reason that I can't stand by while people endure these types of abuse that I went through or worse. And as difficult as it is to present this paper here today, this conference is precisely the kind of context needed to curtail such harm. And so for that reason, I thank Dan and the community here at Harvard, as well as OCAD University for supporting me in this work. This is a time for discussion about the nature and abuse of power, critique, and resourcing towards healing. Working through Foucault focused me on how insidious the control of bodies could be and what the harm of unchecked power can develop into if society is not actively engaged in critique through environments like the university. In this paper, I will show that leader practitioners abusing power, fortified with a capitalization of spirituality and moralized medicine, can cause significant harm to their congregants, especially their most vulnerable. A call to concern for the abuses of power in spiritual communities may not be a priority to many in the current realities of our time, considering climate change and the rise of extremism. But let's not forget that Christianity was at one point in time an alternative spiritual community removed from the state. And yet here we are now in what can be argued to be a Christian state. A state in which the silencing of its genocide committed against indigenous peoples still occurs. The prospect of abuses of power escalating in spiritual communities during the power shifts currently underway in our society weighs heavily on my mind as we delve into this subject. Speaking from experience, I'm particularly concerned with people with disabilities who struggle with consent and for whom abuse is both easier to perpetrate against and easier to cover up. In this presentation of my work in progress, I'll move into framing our discussion by introducing Foucault's concepts of biopower and the pastorate. Then I will offer a Foucaultian examination of the Osho Rajneesh movement as an example of an alternative spiritual community led by a practitioner of alternative medicine. Last, I'll discuss the roles scholars might play in the face of these abuses of power. In the context of the Uses and Abuses of Power in Alternative Spiritualities conference, my deliberation of Foucault's Society Must Be Defended lecture brings me into consider the dynamics of medical power and spiritual power. It should go without saying that power can be abused and the abuse of power in spiritual community can have disastrous effects. The type of individual I have in mind during this presentation is the spiritual leader who is also a practitioner of alternative medicine, who I will call a leader practitioner for short. While the intersections of faith and healing offer opportunities to successfully support community members, the dual role of a leader practitioner poses significant risks for the abuse of power when left unchecked. In the development of an abusive leader practitioner spiritual community, the control over its members is bolstered by information about its congregants' health, which can be considered a form of what Foucault called biopower. No, biopower is not a source of alternative energy, but I understand Foucault's definition of biopower in the context of this paper as the ability to control populations through the use of their medical information. In his Society Must Be Defended lecture on March 17, 1976, Foucault says, medicine is a power knowledge that can be applied to both the body and the population, both the organisms and biological processes. And it will therefore have both disciplinary effects and regulatory effects. Biopower operates through a variety of means, including the medicalization of non-medical issues, population statistics, and disciplinary power. This can take the form of the regularization of how people use their bodies and even as a contributor towards the justification of genocide. In this sense, the body is an object and a site of biopower. Another Foucaultian term that is key to understanding the biopower in spiritual communities in this paper is the pastorate. To paraphrase Foucault, the pastorate begins when a religion constitutes itself as a unit that claims to govern people in their daily life on the grounds of spiritual promise, and to do this at the scale of state and of humanity. The pastorate imposes total control over the individual's life by demanding that they expose themselves to the gaze of the pastorate in complete obedience. This power has historically been uncontested and was considered unabusable because it was understood as a representation of divine self-gift. In explaining the process that leads up to the emergence of biopower after the scientific revolution, Foucault gives us a European context. He describes the Reformation as the greatest revolt of conduct the Christian West has known, which followed a change into which the pastorate, quote, burst open, broke up. This breaking up continued with the scientific revolution into what Foucault called a de-governmentalization of the cosmos, which popped the bubble of a theologically integrated universe as it had been understood in the European pastorate up to that time. In doing so, it revealed, as Foucault put it, quote, that ultimately God only rules the world through general, immutable, and universal laws. Upon the church's breakup during the Reformation, the pastorate leaked into society through modes of government and new modes of control over the population. My research shows that the civic modes of control can be used by religious communities in a biopower of the pastorate. My methodological contribution in this paper is the pastoral biopower heuristic as a tool that can be used to understand alternative spiritual communities that have medicine as part of their purview. Considering the definition of biopower that I discussed, I researched a variety of alternative spiritual communities with leader practitioners through primary and secondary sources, including historical records, personal testimonies, and scholarly analyses to examine the biopower in each case. The two most poignant examples of the uses of biopower I found were the Osho Rajneesh movement and the People's Temple. The leader of the People's Temple, Jim Jones, exhibited a level of leader practitioner biopower in the sense that he claimed the power of faith healing. While this did fit my criteria in some ways, the Osho Rajneesh movement embodied more facets of the biopower I was looking to examine, which is why I chose to focus on this movement exclusively for this paper. One facet of biopower in the Osho Rajneesh movement is a kind of capitalistic statecraft in the building of the Rajneeshpuram community in Oregon. In the Osho Rajneesh movement, the amount donated by a congregant functioned as a sort of statistic, a metric by which the virtuous were measured and rewarded. The organization's capitalist biopower was used in many ways to make Osho very wealthy. Osho's power as a spiritual leader facilitated his financial abuse. An infamous part of Osho's leadership team, Sheila Ambalal Patel, notes that, quote, Bhagwan has a good carrot in front of his people, meditation and enlightenment. When he had enough or when he wanted to help me with finances so my work becomes a little easier, he dangled the carrot of enlightenment. He declared a few people enlightened. Osho himself claimed, it's true, it is true. I exploit people. I exploit them because that is the only way to wake them up. Also saying, I sell contentment. I sell enlightenment. In fact, the dangerous scope of the Osho Rajneesh movement was flagged by American legal authorities when Osho was in the process of building the Rajneeshpuram religious community in Oregon. The US sociologist Lewis F. Carter notes that an important obstacle for legally incorporating Rajneeshpuram as a town was that church and state seemed inappropriately mixed. It is in this way that Osho affected the principles of Foucaultian control and reflects the pastoral biopower model. In this example, Osho acting as an agent of the pastorate as a spiritual leader, while leveraging a state-like notion of capitalistic biopower, permeates his self-understanding of spiritual leadership. His control over wealth functioned as a metric that measures or gives spiritual enlightenment as an expression of pastoral biopower. Osho's abuse as a leader practitioner exploited the desire for healing and trust of his followers and would force control over their physical and emotional welfare, while imposing rules that reinforced harmful power structures, like overly taxing physical work as part of his therapeutic spiritual practice. Psychiatrist James S. Gordon shares that there are testimonies that the Rajneesh movement changed in several ways in Oregon. Suddenly, huge amounts of work and money were needed to realize the vision of the Rajneeshpuram community. Work replaced meditation as the main occupation for the disciples. Work took place 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. It is in this way that overwork was leveraged in Rajneeshpuram as a form of pastoral biopower. Work happens under the obedience of Osho's spiritual authority but it is, in fact, abuse because it funds his corrupt overspending on things like his collection of Rolls Royces. The grueling type of control imposed in Rajneeshpuram ironically paints the state as having more humane forms of biopower than the community congregants it escaped oppression into. This is an example of an alternative spiritual community that took notions of biopower from the state and then took them to extremes. Rajneeshpuram therapists were facilitating a variety of therapies, among them Rajneesh's particular variety of Neo-Tantra. Many cases of abuse to members' health were committed under the purview of Osho's therapeutic leadership, including physical and sexual violence under the guise of his therapies during a ritual breaking of taboos. Osho claimed that these therapies were ways to rewrite old ways of being and to create a, quote, new morality. The biopower exhibited in these therapies was the use of bodies and sexualities forced into contexts that are presented as a sort of salvific good, while controlling the individual. The pastoral biopower exhibited by Osho in this case abused Eastern spiritual models, Eastern spiritual methods proposed as being liberatory in a Western sense of sexuality, while in the context of Rajneeshpuram, they were in fact more regimented. The therapeutic pastoral biopower of the Osho Rajneesh movement can be understood through Foucault's notion of the panopticon, a kind of prison with the constant possibility of observation, therefore leading the prisoner to constantly self-monitor. Osho's biopower became a kind of panopticon prison through the role of the therapist he enshrined into the community. Sociologist of religion Susan J. Palmer states that when the Rajneesh movement moved to Oregon in 1981 and Rajneesh retired into silence, the therapists assumed a priestly role as part of the process of the institutionalization of charisma. Therapists in Rajneeshpuram were tasked with supporting the deprogramming of the self of all isms as per Rajneesh therapy. Osho described that their basic approach is such that whosoever becomes a part of us, we deprogram. In this way, the Rajneesh movement was a perfect storm that leveraged the moralization of illness to mislead, control behavior, and make congregants more vulnerable to give up their money. To draw methodological conclusions here, the panopticon of therapeutic practice in Rajneeshpuram is a fusion of biopower and pastoral techniques of supposedly secular psychology subsumed into the spiritual authority of the Osho Rajneesh movement. This dynamic signals a porousness of the state and pastoral structures of control, which are so often thought of as acting independently. Historian of new religious movements Peter Clark writes that Rajneesh therapy, quote, functioned as a conversion technique, inducing people who were not in a fit state to make a decision to take sannyas and become disciples of Rajneesh, and also as a means of inculcating submission and obedience to their master. Clearly, healing and or therapy can be and is used to legitimate or bolster power and authority, and there are examples of this among new religions and new religions that are the creation of charismatic leaders. Osho's pastoral work used a medicalization of the follower's morality, fusing the medical gaze and the pastoral gaze. The risk of abuse by a leader practitioner is especially significant once they have intensified influence over the subject's lives by compounding their role of moral authority and that of medical authority. The leader practitioner brings the medical gaze into the pastorate, increasing the likelihood of abuse of power. The result of such abuse controls the congregant by holding hostage the perception of their own health In this process, they are indoctrinated into a moralized view of their health and a medicalized view of their morality. The danger stems from how medicalized morality embodies a depth of control that renders the subject particularly powerless in front of a faith leader. The harm that can occur to the individual and to society through this extraordinary level of vulnerability and control can't be overstated. In fact, as an example of the extension of such harm, the Osho Rajneesh movement in Rajneeshpuram was responsible for the largest bioterrorist attack in US history, causing a salmonella outbreak in September 1984. Compounding spiritual support and medical treatment without oversight poses a great risk, and it can lead to disastrous consequences, not only for congregants, but for the community at large. The Foucaultian lens of pastoral biopower offers an understanding of the abuses of power in alternative spiritual communities. In an attempt to counteract such power, I offer two models, a discussion model of critical resistance and a digital humanities model of empowering the abused. In presenting this paper, I call attention to the need for continued discussion and research surrounding the pastoral biopower of faith leaders in alternative spiritual communities as we grapple with the implications of these dynamics in our own spaces. By defending and encouraging a culture of critique and accountability, we can continue to nurture alternative spiritual communities by prioritizing their members' sustained well-being and autonomy while limiting the risks of the abuse of pastoral biopower. Encouraging critique is one of the unique roles scholars play in how alternative spiritual communities can protect themselves. This may seem obvious to some, but in many spiritual communities, deference and subservience are indoctrinated behaviors for their congregants. So it bears noting and repeating. In examining our experiences, we then help others to avoid, or at the very least, curtail the effects of harmful practices. It's in that space of ongoing and refined clarity that healing can have a chance to begin. A community with no way to voice grievances is a community in danger. In addition to formal academic discussions and critique of the abuses of pastoral biopower as proposed, I would like to suggest a data-oriented method as per the slide shown here, to counteract the harmful effects of pastoral biopower for people who have suffered under it. It's to this point that I suggest some additional tools drawn from my main area of research in the digital humanities. My work uses the Markdown programming language and backlinking software to model texts as a set of qualitative data. Through these techniques, I aim to increase community agency and organizational transparency through quantitative measures of power dynamics, sentiment analysis, and the detection of manipulation and indoctrination. These techniques offer an opportunity to visualize the often invisible abuse of pastoral biopower. These tools and techniques developed by my team at Studio MTO are aimed at empowering oppressed communities through the development of intentionally accessible methods in the sense that they are anti-ableist, anti-racist, and anti-colonial, built with the tools economic accessibility and the user's security in mind. Tools like these are especially important today, considering how censorship can aggravate the abuses of pastoral biopower in alternative spiritual communities. Through the development of such tools, we enable community resilience as a means to empower the critique of the abused. My Foucaultian reading of the abuse of biopower in alternative spiritual communities by the leader practitioner unpacks how this intersection of biopower and pastoral biopower can be used to exploit authority and impose influence over the vulnerable people seeking spiritual and physical healing. As I'm saying that, I'm realizing the slide didn't change due to technical difficulties, but the slides will be available on my website after. This paper is also a call to action for scholars and members of alternative spiritual communities alike. By growing and defending space for critique and scholarly inquiry, alternative spiritual communities can avoid occasions of harm and continue to engage in their unique missions. In doing this, we support them to continue being spaces for healing, growth, and transformation, as opposed to spaces of exploitation and abuse. By delivering this paper in the brave space of critique, while providing a series of avenues for investigation, my hope is that I can in some way contribute towards how alternative spiritual communities can reclaim power to identify, resist, and seek healing from harm caused by alternative leader practitioners. The separation of church and state is more porous than one might think. And I would like to reinforce a call for recognition of how secular biopower and church pastoral biopower can fuse dangerously. In this paper, I showed how congregants can flee into appealing spiritual communities only to be misled into more dangerous conditions. Pastoral biopower needs to be identified thoroughly and critiqued urgently.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.